Okay, comrades, I would like to welcome you all very much to this debate between the Revolutionary Communist Group and the Spartacist League of Britain. My name is Evelyn McColgan. I am co-chairing the meeting with Comrade Robert Clough, who's here on my left. And we, just by way of introduction, I want to say we really thank the RCG comrades for accepting the debate proposal. There's much that we agree on, both groups. We have worked together on a number of things, on, for example, on defense work, which we both take very seriously, both organizations. We have worked on Palestinian demonstrations. We've even worked together in your party. We shared the pain of a lot of the work in your party. So it's entirely appropriate today that we have a debate on recognizing the issues that unite us and that we agree on. We also debate the issues where we don't agree. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone in the room, this is a very unusual event, type of event, on the British left. Everyone, like normally speaking, every group keeps to themselves, to their own turf, speaks to their own people that they agree with them, kind of preaching to the choir. But when you have a debate, the challenge is you're speaking, must speak to people who by definition don't agree with you. And I think that's very unusual, very productive. We would very much like it to be, enjoyable and constructive, be in a face-to-face debate as opposed to in a WhatsApp group or something like that. Whoever you challenge is going to answer back, so it forces us to be accurate in representing the other group's positions. We are doing it in good faith, and we think that we would like to keep it constructive and comradely, even though, of course, a room full of communists, there's going to be some cut and thrust of political debate, shall we say. But keep it comradely, and like I said, it should be enjoyable. So here's the format that both organizations have agreed to beforehand. There will be one speaker on each side. We had a toss of a coin. It was tossed by Comrade Robert. Spartacist League won. How democratic is that? And so Comrade Vincent David on my right here will go first. He's the speaker for the Spartacist League. He's the editor of Workers' Hammer and of Spartacist Journal. And on the left, the speaker for the Revolutionary Communist Group is Comrade Cass Howarth. So she will speak second, also for 25 minutes. Then we will open the floor for discussion. We have co-chairs because there's two groups involved. So in the discussion, we will come back to the kind of format for the discussion from the floor a little bit later. But we're going to give the first three speakers, speakers on the floor will be either for the Spartacist League speaker, for the RCG speaker, or independent. You need to declare, one or other. The first three speakers will be RCG and Spartacist League. Then right. We will open it up for independents. If you've lost me, we'll come back to it, and I'm sure Robert will repeat it. Is there anything you wanted to add to the introduction, Robert?
No, I think it's important to point out that we agreed co-chairs because it was not possible to find an independent chair who was available to chair the meeting. So that's why we have what is possibly a rather curious arrangement, but I'm sure it'll work.
Thank you. It will work. One other small thing is the rounds, the presentations will be timed. The discussion from the floor will be timed. We have Comrade Simone here at the front who will be timing you and showing you your cards. So please do respect that. you know, I motivated him to comrade from the RCG on the grounds that he times our Spartacist League meeting. He's very good at shutting Spartacists up. So I'm sure he'll do the same with RCG comrades and independents. So without further ado, we will begin. I will introduce Comrade Vincent David, speaking for the Spartacist League.
Right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yes? So my name is Vincent, as you know. It's a pleasure to be here for this debate. Thank you for the RCG for accepting the proposal, and I hope this can be a productive exchange. So in the last year, the Spartacist League and the RCG have collaborated on a number of occasions, from the defense of the SOAS II to protests for Cuba, for Venezuela, to the Your Party saga, as my comrade Evelyn mentioned. And we share and we respect many things with the RCG. Your work among prisoners, your tireless solidarity with oppressed nations fighting against imperialism, Cuba, Venezuela, Ireland, etc. Your hatred for opportunists, for laborites, for middle-class liberals, and your insistence that the fight against imperialism and against racism are both key for revolutionaries. And honestly, this is a strength, especially today, as most of the socialist left really apologizes for pro-imperialist liberals. And crucially, I think we agree on with the basic conception which animates the RCG as a tendency, and which is also the fundamental of Leninism, the necessity for a split between revolutionaries and social chauvinists in the working class movement. As Lenin wrote, quote, "Unity with the social chauvinists means unity with one's own national bourgeoisie, which exploits other nations. It means splitting the international proletariat," end quote. So as this debate is titled, How to Fight Imperialism, I think we share a broad agreement that building an anti-imperialist movement requires the most resolute struggle against union bureaucrats, against liberals, and particularly against this labor government and its defenders. However, our fundamental disagreements, I believe, lies precisely in how to wage this fight and with what method. And this is where I think the problems with the RCG emerge. And so what I want to argue today is that the RCG's work is fundamentally hampered by ultra-leftism and moralism. So to see this, let me first present a bit how we view the objective situation facing socialists and our tasks. So the world situation today is characterized by the decline of US imperialism. Trump is on the offensive against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, and all of this is really geared to shore up the declining position of the American ruling class. And Trump really represents a shift in the empire's strategy. Before, the rulers justified US hegemony with hypocritical facade of liberal values and so-called progressive quote-unquote values. That was the liberal world order. And now Trump is really smashing this and really imposing US dictates through brute force and chauvinism. And as for the British ruling class, since it's a junior partner in the American empire, it must follow in lockstep. And the current shift to the right, the rise of reform, really represents this growing need for the ruling class in Britain to help the US shore up its position, break with the liberal status quo, and really increase repression on workers, on immigrants, on leftists, etc. So the problem we confront in building an anti-imperialist movement is twofold. So first, the leaders of the trade unions and the left have led us from defeat to defeat. From the Greens to left laborites to union leaders to your party or whatever was left of it, all have embraced really the liberal politics of the last decades and are trying to save them. Liberal anti-racism, liberal identity politics, a liberal view of the state, a liberal view of imperialism. And this has made our movements toothless while associating the left with the defense of the status quo, really. A sort of radical version of Blairism, if I say. Second, as a direct consequence of this first problem, the bulk of the working class is turning to the right. So Reform today is now the largest party among workers, especially outside big cities. And Tommy Robinson has more authority among disillusioned workers than any left-talking politician, in my opinion. And the socialist left, in general, has next to no influence in the working class. This is for us the most serious problem confronting the socialist movement. And this is why the Palestine movement, for example, despite huge marches, like for years, has been quite impotent in really affecting the genocide. It's because its leaders kept it in chained to respectable, liberal, pacifist politics, while at the same time the working class, as an organized force, really did not play a role in that movement. So, for us, building an anti-imperialist movement requires solving these two problems. And so the first thing we say is that socialists must turn away from like middle class, petit bourgeois campus and really turn to the working class. Go into the working class, fight for what it needs, and do really the painstaking work of rebuilding the trade union movement. And this is how we think we can bridge the gap which exists right now between the working class and the socialist movement, and really connect the exploitation of workers at home with imperialist plunder abroad. And second, revolutionaries must fight within the left for a break with liberal politics. And this is really the cancer holding back our movement. Socialists can't fight the insurgent right in an alliance with liberal, middle-class politicians who are trying to save the status quo. And so we fight for revolutionary regroupment among socialists, really on this basis. But how do we do this exactly? Because to do this, Marxists cannot just shout revolution from the sidelines, or it's not enough to just denounce this or that leader as a traitor. People have real illusions in the Green Party, in Corbyn, in left-talking union bureaucrats, and even a lot of workers have illusions in Nigel Farage. And so Marxists must start really from the real experience and be able to connect with the sentiment of the masses and really be able to use contradictions within those various movements in order to exacerbate class polarizations, class divisions within them. So we must be able, for example, to use the contradiction between workers who want to fight and their leaders who won't do a damn thing. Between people who want socialism but who are backing the Green Party. Between people who want to fight racism and Farage but the liberal dead end offered by the Together Alliance and Stand Up to Racism. And even between workers fed up with the status quo and who might be looking to the reactionary option of reform. So fighting for revolutionary leadership really consists precisely in being able to insert a wedge in these contradictions, to exacerbate these sort of class polarizations that I described along a clear line directed at the ruling class. And really to try to push forward the progressive aspiration against the obstacles set up by reactionary and reformist leaders. But I think this is exactly what the RCG's method fails to do. So, in my view, for the RCG, contradictions really do not exist. Everything is always, I find, black and white, good or bad. You have trade unions, bad. You have the Labour Party, bad. You have Stand Up to Racism, bad. And you have Cuba, good. You have Venezuela, good. And in every struggle, I find the RCG to be flattening real existing contradictions and really disappearing the class struggle that exists within the organization of the working class and within the anti-imperialist movement itself. And because you see no fracture along class line, you do not have a wedge to insert. And really this is, I find, a quite rigid and sterile approach of politics, which turns political struggle from a fight to advance the interest of our class into a sort of moral testament or an act of witness. We go to an event, we denounce the leaders as traitor, we sell the paper, we get contacts, and then we can go back having done our duty and, sort of anyway, the rest of the left are a bunch of opportunists. And then whenever the movement is betrayed, we can say, we told you so. However, this isn't revolutionary intervention, comrades. Because it plays no constructive role in the movement. It does not strengthen the authority of communists in the eyes of others. And since you present yourself, or tend to present yourself as sort of counterposed to the movement, it allows really the reformist leaders to dismiss you as people who do not want to build the movement of the working class, of the oppressed, etc. And so those leaders that you denounce as traitors, even though it's perfectly true, they do not stand exposed. Now, I might be a bit harsh. I'm not trying to caricature here. I do not doubt here the sincerity of RCG members. But if the RCG is to play a progressive role in the stormy period ahead and really fight to rebuild the socialist movement, I think you must urgently break with this ultra-leftism and I think moralism. And we in the Spartacist League, we know a thing or two about this. Because a few years ago, honestly, we underwent a profound reorientation. The document from our conference are on our lit table to really break from a very similar method than the one I think I just described. And so Lenin called this an infantile disorder from his book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Now I know, every opportunist in this country loves this book because they think it justifies their opportunism, right? They say, oh, we can vote Labor every election. That's not what this book says. This book is about really the method of Bolshevism. It teaches you that to build a revolutionary party, it's not enough to have the right ideas. People have to adopt those ideas. And they must see that anti-imperialism and Marxism aren't some abstract thing for like enlightened people, but that they are essential for victory, for the victory of the working class struggle today. And I think this is really the method the RCG reject. And I think this is most obvious on the trade union question, so let's get into it. The RCG uses the theory of the labor aristocracy to argue that the trade union movement, because it tends to represent better off workers, is simply a tool of imperialism. In his article titled British Trade Unions, Bastions of Reactions, the comrade Robert Clough writes that, quote, there is no evidence that trade unions in Britain are or will be the foundations for social progress, end quote. And then he concludes that they are simply bastions of reactions. And then sort of any attempt at fighting within the unions is thus opportunism. It's what the opportunist left does, and we should more or less turn our back on them, and the article concludes, go to the streets. Now, comrades, I think this is anti-Marxist. So let's get something out of the way. The trade unions are led by the worst pro-imperialist scoundrels and labor aristocrats. And yes, they do, in some layers, represent more privileged sectors. But to take these truths and label the entire union movement as a bastion of reaction is really grotesque, and it amounts really to making a common cause with the ruling class on this question. The trade unions are the most elementary defensive organization that the working class has. However wretched their leaders might be, the union is sort of the only line of defense that the workers have. And in turn, the ruling class always wants to break the unions, right? The ruling class considers the unions as bastion of reaction as well. And so the question is pretty simple. Like, is it better for a worker to be unionized or not unionized? Obviously, it's better to be in a union. Do communists care when the bourgeoisie attacks the trade unions and wants to destroy the trade union? Of course we care, and we defend every union against and despite their treacherous leadership. When Thatcher smashed the miners' union, did it impacted the rest of the working class? Of course it did. It was a massive defeat. And so I find that the RCG's analysis on this question is based, I think, on a wooden view, which really ignores basic facts of the class struggle. And really, Lenin spent his life fighting against such conception. So he wrote in this book I just showed, I'll quote, to refuse to work in the reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward masses of workers under the influence of the reactionary leaders, the agents of the bourgeoisie, the labor aristocrats, end quote. And at Lenin's urging, the Third Congress of the Comintern, if you know a bit that history, doesn't matter if you don't, the Third Congress of the Comintern was really dedicated to fighting the idea that communists should turn their back on the trade unions. I recommend you just have a look at the thesis on tactics adopted at the Third Congress of the Comintern. I'll just briefly quote. So, quote, from the very first year of its existence, the Communist International rejected sectarian tendencies by calling on its affiliated parties, no matter how small, to participate in the trade unions, to defeat the reactionary bureaucracy from within and to transform the unions into revolutionary mass organization of the proletariat, end quote. So it's all there. You go to the unions, build socialist caucuses in them, and really fight to defeat the labor aristocracy from within. And that's what we seek to do. And yes, the unions have changed since the 1920s, but they have not undergone any qualitative transformation. And so, at bottom, the notion that the trade unions are so reactionary, such bastions of reaction, that communists should not bother with them, is really just a capitulation to that union bureaucracy, who bears the responsibility of sabotaging the anti-imperialist struggles, who bears responsibility of making sure that there hasn't been a single serious trade union action in defense of Palestine, and who is propping up this labor government. And lastly, just look at the recent strike wave in 2022, 2023. So inflation pushed workers to fight, forcing those union leaders to do something and get up their ass for once. But because the RCG believes that unions are bastion of reactions and that communists should not really bother to or dedicate their task of fighting that bureaucracy from within, you found yourself outside the struggle. And we fought with our modest forces as hard as we could to really build those strikes against the union leaders. We particularly fought on the slogan, never cross a picket line, and picket line means don't cross, which involved a struggle at every step against trade union bureaucrats all the time. But the strike wave was defeated by those union bureaucrats, and really that defeat was paved the way for Starmer's election, the racist riots, the rise of reform, etc. And so it's a crime that group like the Socialist Workers' Party or the Socialist Party just went on to cheer those union leaders, like Micklin, Sharon Graham, etc. However, because the RCG placed itself also outside this crucial movement, honestly, the result is the same, As the opportunists cheer those rotten union bureaucrats, the sectarians are not fighting them as well. They're outside of it. Same result. And this alone, I think, should be enough for comrades to really rethink their entire conception. And really, if the trade unions are a bastion of reaction, well, what do comrades propose? Comrades Claude says to go to the streets, fine, but most mass demonstrations are organized by the unions or by groups directly tied to them, so that doesn't solve the problem. We could go to the unorganized workers. Definitely we need to go to the unorganized workers, they're the majority. But even then, you will have to struggle against that bureaucracy, and much better to have communist workers inside the mainstream unions. So for me, this whole theory of bastion of reactions really flows exactly from the sterile method I've outlined above. It's unable to see really the class contradictions inside the union movement between workers and privileged bureaucrats. And because of this, the RCG, I think, deserts one of the most important fields of struggle in this country. And this is a deep problem because in Britain, history shows that mass struggles often erupt through the historic institution of the workers' movement. Not always, but that's sort of the history. That's what the strike wave showed. But that's also what the Corbyn experience showed in the Labour Party. I'll just make a brief point on Labour. In 2015, mass discontent against austerity and war expressed itself through the Labour Party because the Labour Party has a similar contradiction as in the unions, pro-imperialist, the worst pro-imperialist leaders, as we see, but then, it's the historic party that workers vote for, affiliated to the unions. Now, this contradiction is pretty dormant right now. I don't want to have a dispute this. And recognizing this contradiction doesn't mean you vote for the Labour Party at every election, like every opportunist does, but it does mean that communists must learn to exploit this contradiction. The Labour Party is really the historic obstacle to revolution in this country, and you're not going to defeat it really from the sidelines by calling it just imperialist or just listing its crimes, even all true. You need to really split it along class line. And so that for us to build an anti-imperialist movement in this country, you need the workers, and for that really you need to fight the pro-imperialist bureaucracy in their power base, where they are based. And I think those communists, those comrades like the RCG, really, with this theory of bastion of reactions, are really putting themselves on the margin of the mainstream working class movement and actually will stay there with such theory. I want to make a brief point on the Global South. For the RCG, for me, the view that the workers' movement in Britain is essentially bought off goes for me hand in hand with uncritical support for Cuba, the Cuban government, the Venezuelan government, the Palestinian resistance, and other forces. And I see it really as a mirror image. No contradiction, just black and white. Now, I can't go into a whole development on Cuba, on Palestine, on Ireland, etc. All I'll say is that as Marxists, we take a clear side with anti-imperialist forces and oppressed nations against US imperialism and the Zionist state. However, it is also our duty to put forward a communist strategy of struggle against the perspective of the current leaders of the anti-imperialist struggle. And this is not out of purity, or it's really out of the conviction that the liberation struggle cannot succeed without an internationalist and communist strategy. And for us, one cannot be a Marxist and argue that Venezuela cutting oil to Cuba isn't like a complete betrayal, or deny that a substantial portion of the Cuban Communist Party or the Islamic Republic wants to deal with the United States. Saying so isn't a capitulation to the imperialist rulers. It's really, for us, a necessity to orient the liberation struggle. And the same is true for a struggle much closer to home, Ireland. I do need to mention it if we're going to talk about imperialism in Britain. So, of course, communists in Britain must fight to end the British occupation of the 6 counties, and actually fight for this in the trade unions, I would add. I'm sure we agree on this. But for us, the task of communists in Ireland is also to fight for communist leadership in the Irish struggle against really a nationalist strategy which has proved it cannot free Ireland. So once again, in the anti-imperialist struggle, the RCG really, for me, disappears class contradictions again. Abroad, we have like almost a pure anti-imperialist struggle, free of privileged layers, of conservative influence, of betrayal and accommodations to imperialism, and then at home we have a workers' movement which is simply a tool of imperialism. Well, for me, the end result is that it kind of robs communists of any decisive intervention. Because abroad we just support whatever forces is fighting at the moment, and at home we're sort of condemned to the margins of the mainstream workers' movement. I'll do a brief word on your party before concluding. Your party was interesting because the RCG entered it. And because you did recognize that there was a contradiction, right, between Corbyn's liberal politics and what Sultana was pushing, particularly against Zionism, and how popular that was at the base of the party. Well, that's good, and it's really on this basis that we were able to collaborate in often dreadful meetings. But I have to be frank, I do believe the RCG still led an ultra-left interventions. Because, you see, members in your party, they wanted the project to work. And they had illusions in Corbyn and Sultana, and they were quite wary also of small left groups like ourselves, who do have a reputation of building themselves at the expense of the movement. That's true. That's a problem. So comrades, going to every meeting to denounce Corbyn as a Zionist, or going to Sultana's meeting and call on her to immediately split from your party was not going to work. It was not going to expose them, because you really set yourself against every single aspirations of the people in the room. And you and that kind of intervention made it easy for Corbyn to say, oh, look at the RCG, typical left groups, they're not interested in building your party. And it was true. The goal of your intervention wasn't to say, to make your party successful, we have to fight Corbyn's politics. That was our sort of general approach. We have a pamphlet on the table that you can look at. The goal of your intervention was more to say, well, Corbyn is a Zionist, and Sultana should split. And then sort of comrades denounced the whole thing when it fell apart after. So, in my opinion, your intervention did not help to strengthen the left in your party against the right. And you cannot intersect effectively the contradictions and the progressive impulses which animated people in your party. Now, much more could be said, of course, but I'll conclude. For me, the fight against imperialism means the fight against the pro-imperialist leaders of the trade union of the Labour Party. We agree on this. But to really do this, the RCG has to break with a sectarian and sterile method, which I think really hampers that struggle in every way. What's needed, I think, in Britain would be to build a campaign right now to shut down US bases in Britain. But you see very quickly that if you have a rigid and sterile method which avoids the mainstream organization of the workers' movement, you can't push such a campaign, really. And I think to fight imperialism, we need workers. And right now, too few of them are looking to the left as for leadership. And I think you're not going to win the working class by labeling their trade unions bastion of reaction, many of whom are proud trade unionists and are proud to be union members, despite their hatred for the leaders of the union. And you're also not going to win the working class by presenting abroad like a flawless anti-imperialist struggle, really concealing, I think, real betrayals. Now, I've been hard against the RCG. My criticism are made from a comradely standpoint, and I hope we will continue to work together. But I really want, basically what I want the determination, the courage, the energy of RCG members to be put to use inside against those bureaucrats where they have their power. So I urge you to really make a break with this method, and which is, I think, preventing you from really intersecting the living reality of the workers' movement. Thank you.
Ooh. Thank you, Comrade Vincent. So now it's over to you, Cass.
Comrades, we have heard what the Spartacist League have to say, and I will return to some of their points later on, and I know my comrades from the floor will also deal with those. But first, I want to set out who, what, and why the RCG is. Britain is a major imperialist power. Over the last 150 years, the very structure of British capital, and therefore the nature of the working class movement, has been determined by this obvious but seldom acknowledged reality. It is this understanding that lies at the heart of our politics. It's now 50 years nearly since the Revolutionary Communist Group first published our newspaper. Its name, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, reflected our recognition that the fight against racism and imperialism are inextricably linked, and that no movement for socialism in this country can be built unless that understanding is central to both its theory and its practice. And this understanding has been born out of practical political experience. Campaigning in solidarity with the Irish liberation struggle of the 1970s and within the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, to organising against British state racism and against the brutal warmongering of British imperialism, standing in solidarity with struggles for self-determination around the world. And it was through these struggles that we learned the centrality of fighting imperialism for a revolutionary working class movement in Britain. And it defined the separation of our trend and the rest of the traditional British left. So how do we fight imperialism? Well, first, we must understand it. We start, following Lenin, from the recognition that we live in the age of imperialism, that is to say, monopoly capitalism. As Lenin says, the enormous dimensions that capital has reached are the most characteristic and essential feature of imperialism. The place of free competition has been taken by huge monopolies. These features that he describes are even more pronounced today, and yet many on the British left continue to ignore the central question of imperialism or even deny that it exists here today. Imperialism is the historical period of the decay of capitalism and is characterized by parasitism. The capitalist system, by restricting production to the narrow limits of profit-making, is an inherently crisis-ridden system. It is the era of finance capital in which enormously concentrated banking capital has fused with industrial and commercial capital. The export of capital, that is to say, global investment, as opposed to the export of commodities, is imperialism's distinguishing feature. As I'm sure we all agree, the very nature of capitalism means that it can never satisfy the basic needs of the vast majority of humanity. In order to continue producing profits, capitalism develops into a global system of national oppression, and it splits the world into oppressed and oppressor nations. Imperialism divides the world into both these oppressed and oppressor nations, with the majority of the world's population living in poverty, while a small minority squanders unprecedented wealth. But crucially, imperialism also divides the working class in the imperialist country. Through the super profits it creates, it is able to essentially bribe a section of the working class, an upper layer, a labour aristocracy, whose privileges are based on imperialist plunder. As Lenin recognized, this layer acts as a buffer between the ruling class within the working class, for the ruling class within the working class movement, seeking to divert struggle away from any real challenge to state power to the ruling class. In Britain, this labour aristocracy has traditionally expressed itself through the Labour Party, and of course it controls the trade union movement. We have seen time and time again how these forces act to control and divert any independent or spontaneous movement by the mass of the working class down the dead end of reformist or electoral politics. It is for this reason that Lenin argued, the fight against imperialism is a sham and humbug unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism. So those who argue that any kind of accommodation or unity of these forces can somehow advance the cause for socialism are ignoring this important point stressed by Lenin, which is that economically, the desertion of the labour aristocracy to the bourgeoisie is an accomplished fact. A split has occurred in the working class, and this opportunist trend can neither disappear nor return to the revolutionary proletariat. The sections of the working class who make up the labour aristocracy may change with changes in production and industry. The decline of manufacturing and heavy industry in Britain after the Second World War, for example, or the rise of technological and white-collar work. It was John Foster who made the point that a change in the makeup of the privileged layer of the working class in no way makes the labour aristocracy redundant. He said, to see this as the end would be to miss the whole essence of the labour aristocracy, to see it purely descriptively in just one of its forms, and to ignore its historical role and development as the active process by which labour's class organisation was purged of anti-capitalist elements and made safer for economism and spontaneity. In an imperialist country like Britain, the ruling class could not stay in power and maintain the facade of bourgeois democracy without winning the allegiance of a section of the working class to its side. But not just any section. It must be a stratum which controls the principal organisations of the working class and which can constantly exclude any revolutionary element from these organisations. So we are quite clear. There are divisions within the working class, the most significant of which is the split between the labour aristocracy and the mass of the working class. This understanding is absolutely crucial for laying the foundations for building an anti-imperialist movement in this country. And yet, the Spartacists appear to have absolutely no grasp of this essential feature of the working class. Like virtually the entire British left, they reject the concept of the labour aristocracy, suggesting either that it was a figment of Lenin's imagination or somehow it has disappeared at some unspecified point over the last 100 years. But it must be understood that the theory of imperialism, Lenin's theory of imperialism, is the theory of the labour aristocracy. And to reject it is not just to reject Lenin, but also to reject Marx and Engels, who had already noted that the vast wealth plundered by the British Empire in the 19th century was allowing the bribing of a section of the working class who were becoming better defenders of the bourgeoisie than the bourgeoisie themselves. To reject the concept of the labour aristocracy is to reject Lenin's analysis of imperialism in its entirety. Is this the absurd position that the Spartacists will defend today? Identifying the reality of the labour aristocracy means that communists need to challenge it, and Lenin was clear. He said, the only Marxist line in the world labour movement is to explain to the masses the inevitability and necessity of breaking with opportunism, to educate them for revolution by waging a relentless struggle against opportunism, to utilise the experience of the war to expose, not conceal, the utter vileness of national liberal labour politics. He was clear that without a relentless struggle against opportunism, it is impossible to speak of building a socialist movement. And he was absolutely insistent on this point, on the need to recognise the existence of this split, arguing in some notes written in 1920 against those who spoke of the proletariat as an undifferentiated whole, as we have heard so far today. He said, the concrete is brushed aside, but they keep on talking about the proletariat in general. Continuing, the proletariat, not in general, not in abstracto, but in the 20th century, after the imperialist war, inevitably split from the upper stratum. Evasion of the concrete, deception by means of abstractions. In other words, to speak of the proletariat or the working class in general is to use an empty abstraction, since either term glosses over the existence of the split that imperialism has created in its ranks. But this is a closed book for the left, and I hope the Spartacists will be able to explain why it is that they do that. Our understanding of imperialism also informs, as I mentioned at the beginning, another core aspect of our politics, the fight against state racism. Racism is the form that national oppression takes in the imperialist country, with migrants and minority ethnic groups among the poorest and most exploited layers of the working class in Britain. A key element of racist control is the use of immigration laws directed at those fleeing the poverty, underdevelopment, and war imposed by imperialism, controlling the flow of labour in the interest of capitalism. The RCG has always opposed all imperialist immigration controls and has played a central role in many anti-racist and anti-deportation campaigns. When we first published FRFI in 1979, British imperialism faced a growing political and economic crisis. This found expression in the war in Ireland, in the assault on the liberation movement in Zimbabwe, British support for the racist government in South Africa, the racist offensive against black people in this country, and attacks on working class living standards, in particular against the public sector. In all of these cases, it was the oppressed masses and the poorer sections of the working class who were bearing the brunt of the attack and who were fighting back and resisting. From these developments came political lessons which guide our practice today. It is precisely because of their daily experience in Britain of British state brutality and repression of poverty, wages, and unemployment. The most oppressed sections of the working class have few illusions in the British state, no matter who is at the helm. And they are therefore the key to the development of an anti-imperialist and socialist movement in Britain. But the majority of the British left divert attention away from the racism in practice of the British state towards the bogeyman of the far right, as though they were somehow a different phenomenon from the racism of the state, rather than an adjunct to it. They fail to confront or understand the role of the state security apparatus, the police, the courts, and its jails, as an essential component for imposing class rule. Racism cannot be separated from imperialism, and FRFI has made this point consistently over the last 47 years, demanding an end to British support for the racist apartheid state in alliance with the black workers and immigrants in the 1980s, calling for British imperialism out of the Gulf in alliance with the Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, and Asian workers in the 1990s, and in the struggle in solidarity today where British state repression is concentrated. But what do the Spartacist League say? Well, frankly, as we've prepared for this debate and we've read their material and we've listened to what has been said so far, it has been quite difficult to determine what it is exactly that they are saying. Their positions and their arguments are confused and confusing. We cannot understand your position on state racism because you scarcely mention it. From what we have seen, you have a shockingly reactionary position on Palestine, suggesting there's a potentially progressive role that the Israeli working class could be playing. Your position on socialist Cuba is indistinguishable from the rest of the left, or in fact, The Guardian. And we want to know what it is that you are saying. How is it that you understand imperialism if you cannot answer these most basic questions? I quoted quite extensively Lenin on the working class. But like the rest of the left that you espouse to despise, you have an abstract position on the working class, and your concept of the trade unions, as we have heard, is idealist and immaterial. The British trade union movement is renowned worldwide for its racism, its backwardness, and its reactionary nature, yet you claim it could play a progressive role in this country. When you talk about the US and US imperialism, with Britain as a lapdog, getting its instructions from the White House, are you denying that Britain is an imperialist power with huge overseas assets? When you have written about the inter-imperialism fallacy, are you arguing that imperialism doesn't necessarily give rise to inter-imperialist rivalries? What about the war on Ukraine? What about Iran? We find so many inconsistencies in what you are saying. You claim there is some undifferentiated working class. We have heard you today talk about the workers, the working class in abstract, who you write are somehow completely separate from migrants, minorities, and trans people. And your positions on immigration appear deeply reactionary, making concessions to the most backward elements of the white working class. Communists in imperialist countries have to concentrate their work among those sections of the working class with no stake in the capitalist system, who are outside of the trade union movement that you talk of. We must fight for their interests and wage a relentless struggle against bourgeois labour parties and official trade union organisations that only represent the interests of the labour aristocracy I have explained about today. At the centre of communist politics, and as a vital part of this struggle, must be opposition to the imperialist state, fighting its brutal exploitation and oppression of the peoples of oppressed nations, its racism and its militarism. In short, the fight against imperialism. We start from the understanding that our main enemy in the oldest imperialist country in the world is at home. That is why our priority is to work with the most class-conscious sections of the working class to create a vanguard party, that is, a communist party, that can lead the struggle for state power. That is how we fight imperialism. Thank you.
But we're now moving into the discussion period, and it will be sequenced according to the order that has been set by the top table. In other words, the first contribution from the floor will be taken from a member of the Spartacist League.
Okay, we'll do Spartacist
Can I quickly
League.
make a point?
Yes.
I think we spoke about 10 minutes shorter. I don't know if you want to utilize.
That's okay.
Do you have a longer summary?
Yes, thank you. So we'll take an SL speaker and then an RCG speaker, as Robert said. We have a kind of a different take on the discussion, to be honest, but we're going to make a compromise so that everyone can speak. So the independents will get to speak after some of the group members of respective groups. So if we can see an indication for the SL, I see Ollie and maybe we can wait, someone can indicate who wants to go after that. Owen. Okay. Now, we were hoping to have 5 minutes for contributions, contributions can be upwards of 5 minutes, and you will get a time warning from Simone here.
You're going to have to take the Wi-Fi thing off of it first.
Yeah, or you can take that.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm a supporter of the Spartacist League. I'm also a rep of one of the big TUC trade unions. I'd like to address the RCG speaker. Our position on the trade unions is idealistic and material. So I think let's get concrete here, because I've done quite a lot of work as a rep in the recent period. Everything I've done in order to advance the struggle of my members in trade unions has every step of the way has been taking on the existing trade union bureaucracy, the misleadership that is treacherous, that is pro-capitalist, that is pro-imperialist, and wants class peace with the bosses, both at a local level and at a national level. So everything I've had to do when I'm fighting against layoffs, when I'm fighting against speed up, with harassment of the boss by the bosses, the most marginalised section of the workers in my workplace, everything I've had to do to bring in the immigrant cleaners into our union and into leadership positions in our branch, everything I've had to do to work alongside the independent trade union amongst the cleaners, whereas before my union would have nothing to do with them, but now we work together as if we were one union. Everything I've had to do has been against the treacherous misleadership of my trade union, you know, and that is the work of socialists. That is the difference socialists have to make in the trade unions, right? Even when I was running for rep, I ran on a mandate. The bureaucracy refused me that mandate, but I did it anyway in defiance of them. I ran as a socialist. I ran against the anti-union laws, overturning the branch's policy, telling us that we had to cross over unions' picket lines. I went against that in practice and by example, and I ran to overturn that policy. I ran so the trade union, my trade union branch would defend workers who were pro-Palestine in the workplace, you know, against their policy, and that you know, that wanted to be activists against the genocide in Israel. This was everything I do is against the bureaucracy, you know, as a socialist, right? You know, this idea that they're bastions of reaction, the misleadership is the Labour aristocracy is based on the Labour lieutenants of capital. You know, they are bought off. They have a stake in the system. The membership, our wages have gone down with inflation and cost of living. That hasn't impacted bureaucracy, but it's impacted the membership, right? But this idea of bastions of reaction, to identify the membership with the treacherous leadership, just an example, just this week, one of my cleaning reps told me this, in the staff room there, we're defending a member at the moment on something, and other non-members of the union were saying, oh, but the union's been bad in the past, they sell out, they'll never get it. And one of the members of the union, an immigrant cleaner, got up and said, how dare you badmouth my union like that? This is what the union's got for me in the past year. They got me this, they got me that, and they fight and they'll get it for the our co-worker. How dare you badmouth our union? They're open to criticism of the bureaucracy and the misleadership. They know they've been sold out by them in the past and currently, and they know we need a different type of union, right? But they will not stand for their unions to be badmouthed, because that is their defence organisation. That is the only thing they've got, and they want to fight to build that and improve that. And they're right in that. Their class consciousness is correct, And I say this to the RCG because I agree with what Vincent said. You guys are impressive. You've got fight, you've got dedication, you're articulate. You're very impressive communists. And we need you fighting alongside us in the unions to change the unions into anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist organisations. So we don't want any more Mick Lynches who go on all the Palestine demos but don't lift a finger to stop military shipments going to Israel. We need different leaders of the unions. We need socialists, and you guys need to join us in that fight. There are in my workplace, there are people that are very vocal about being socialists, and they're members of the unions, but they don't do the bare minimum to build our unions, to strengthen our union, and to, okay, I'll leave it there.
Oh, are you speaking for the RCG? No. Okay, sorry. So you called your own, you want to speak on Will? I guess we'll come back to it. I apologize, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Will Jones, RCG. Well, the position that you've attributed to us on the trade unions is a caricature. I won't focus on that. I mean, the idea that we wouldn't defend workers' wages and conditions, that we wouldn't support this elementary form of class struggle within the trade unions, that's not a conclusion that is in the article that you quoted. The point that we make is that you're not distinguishing between the working class and the trade unions. When you say we must turn to the working class, okay, and from that you say we have to go into the trade unions, and not only some of your members going into the trade unions to organise there, but you're saying we should commit our forces to it. And as Cass has explained very ably, this is the same error that is committed by the rest of the left in Britain, the opportunists, that there is no real separation between the trade unions and the working class, that's what you mean by the working class. We recognise a split in the working class in Britain, which has been created by imperialism. And this is, part of the social reality created in this country, and it's reflected in the trade unions. Okay, we, far from not recognising that there is some differentiation within the trade unions between different workers, we're describing the very split and divisions that you're talking about when we talk about the labour aristocracy, which is not only the leaders of the unions, it's not only bureaucrats, the term that you use in preference over Lenin's language, the labour aristocracy for some reason. It is throughout the unions, okay? They are a relatively privileged minority of the working class in Britain. Only 20% of workers, roughly, are unionised today. This is a shrinking number. They are also an ageing minority of the working class. Today, more than 40% of trade union members are aged over 50. That is the largest age group. They are also very senior members of their workplaces. Most 43% of trade unionists have more than 10 years of service in their employers. These are not precarious workers, okay? And 30.8% of supervisors and foremen are unionised. that is a higher, 30.8% and 20.6% of managers, that is a higher proportion than the rank and file members who are unionised, okay? This is a reflection of the social reality in Britain, and as you say, they are tools of imperialism. They ably represent the interests of the labour aristocracy that the ruling class has deliberately fostered in this country to defend its interests among the workers. And it explains exactly the betrayals and that you've described. Okay, the trade unions, their idea of Palestine solidarity, as we've seen, is wear something green to work or hold up a placard at lunchtime. Okay, workplace days of action. You laugh, but this is explained. Yeah, it has a material basis. It has a material basis in imperialism, which is what you are denying, especially when you say that Britain is not even imperialist power, it is a junior partner in the American empire. A junior partner in the American empire. We can explain, the RCG can explain why the trade unions have historically betrayed all of these struggles. It is in the theory of the labour aristocracy, it is in analysing how the ruling class has created these splits. And if you imagine that, sending our members, the members of our organisation into the trade unions to transform them from within, to change the unions into anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist institutions, well, how do you imagine that is going to happen? How can communists and socialists change this social reality?
I'll take Elizabeth for the SL, and if someone wants to indicate.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth for the SL. I just wanted to start by clarifying, I think there is some confusion about the positions that the SL has in the remarks of the speaker. Oh, sorry, I'm not good with the mic. And so I wanted to clarify that a little bit. First of all, to be clear, we do of course think that Britain is an imperialist power. We do of course think that there's a labour aristocracy in Britain. And we do of course very strongly agree, and in fact I plan to use in my remarks the same quote as the speaker from the RCG did, from Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. I don't think that that's the question. I believe the question is, how is it, as communists in Britain, that we fight to defeat imperialism, to mobilize and strengthen and unify the working class? And I would also like to add that the question isn't, should we do work among the most oppressed sectors of the proletariat, because they do tend to have higher political consciousness. And we agree with this point as well. So I would just like to start by being clear about the problem of the trade unions in Britain. I actually think it's, if you look at the conclusion to the article by Comrade Robert, which was quoted in the presentation, here's the difference. The conclusion was that the trade union movement as a whole is hopeless and we need to start again from the outside. So what is the problem with that? The problem with that is exactly what Comrade Van Sam quoted from the resolution of the Comintern Congress. The problem with that is that it's an abdication of the struggle that Lenin laid out, which your speaker quoted very nicely, to go and fight against it in every opportunity, at every level, against the social chauvinists who lead the trade union movement. I think the example of the strike wave in Britain is an excellent example. Because what happened? The workers in this country, they were faced with inflation. They were faced with inflation because the world was being crushed by American imperialism. And they started to struggle. But they met a leadership that was unwilling to challenge the City of London, that fundamentally supported the interests of British finance capital, and they divided the unions, and they prevented an effective struggle. It's exactly the same criticism that your comrades correctly make of the PSC and the leadership of the Palestine movement. The problem is that you were not in those unions, and that meant you were not able to be a factor in changing the outcome of those struggles. And I'm not saying, no, we should turn our back on the unorganized workers. Of course not. But the strong position to organize the unorganized workers is going to be through fighting through the existing organized trade unions. And I also want to address this question. I feel like with this question of imperialism, there's a problem of method in the way the RCG comrades are approaching this. And I think it's a tick list mentality. It's like, yes or no, is Britain imperialist? Is it not imperialist? Oh, it's imperialist, then we have to just say it's bad and it's imperialist. Immigration, is immigration good or bad? Yes, it's good. You have to understand that the world is a dynamic system. These things change. So after World War II, Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world. It became still an imperialist power, but it's an imperialist power that exploits the world through the dollar system under the military umbrella of the Americans. That doesn't mean it's not imperialist. It doesn't mean it's going to play a progressive role. It doesn't mean its fundamental interests are different. But it's committed to that alliance because that's where its position in the world is. If we as communists can't understand that based on looking at a material understanding of the situation in the world, it's going to prevent us from being able to make a sharp and effective intervention. So, and let's see, I would also like to say that on the question of immigration, we do not support the British bourgeoisie's policies. Yes, it is true, the British bourgeoisie and the American bourgeoisie's immigration policies are inherently racist. But, you know, they have different policies at different times. And as part of the European Union, there was a common policy in Europe, in the UK, in the US, to try and bring in a lot of immigrants in order to specially oppress them and drive down the working conditions of the whole working class. We didn't support that policy either. What is the question? How should communists approach the question of immigration? From our perspective, the way to approach the question of immigration is in the way that's going to be able to unite the immigrant workers and the workers who are not immigrants together in a common struggle to raise everybody's conditions and situation. That's the question. It's not what is the least racist immigration policy that the British imperialists come up with, because whatever immigration policy they come up with is going to serve their own interests. The question is, how do we best strengthen the conditions of the working class? There is a reality in this country that the right wing is rising. I think to deny that and just say, oh, well, it's state, of course the British state is racist, but it's state racism, and to deny the fact that, in fact, the working class in this country is increasingly looking to the right is to render ourselves incapable of dealing with the actual situation and intervening in an effective way.
Yeah, I'm Kudzai speaking for the RCG. When we're speaking of these things, we need to start off from the basis that Britain is the oldest imperialist nation in the world. The imperialist state is necessarily a racist state, and racism is the form that national oppression takes within an imperialist country. Therefore, we can't fight for socialism without fighting imperialism and therefore fighting racism. The British state is the main source of racist oppression. We understand that immigration controls are inherently racist because they enforce a segregated hierarchy of workers. The Labour Party has always carried out the dictates of that state when it's in government. And today we've seen that the Labour Party has deported 60,000 people, has carried out record-breaking arrests, raids and detentions, eroded the rights of asylum seekers, raised the requirements for migrants to work, and expanded the use of detention centres. Our position on racism wasn't developed from abstract schemers, but it was informed by the actual political struggles that we were involved in since our formation. For example, the Viraj Mendes campaign, the Anwar Day Defence campaign, our work defending asylum seekers in Newcastle and Manchester in the 2000s. We've also seen numerous examples of Black and Asian people fighting back against racist policing and immigration controls, such as Brixton in 1981 to every single city in England in 2011. They've also in the past formed their own political organisations, with the Asian youth movements being the pinnacle of this, built from concrete struggles that were miles ahead of the rest of the left. All of this is to say is that fighting state racism is where the class struggle is. For example, as we've seen in Minneapolis in the uprisings against ICE and elsewhere. The Spartacist League claim to oppose stand-up to racism, and so do we. But we oppose stand-up to racism because they don't fight state racism. Because challenging state racism for them would mean coming into conflict with the Labour Party and the trade unions who support immigration controls and make up the base of their support. Therefore, they divert all attention to the far right. But the far right cannot deport people. It cannot brutalise migrants. It cannot incarcerate black people at disproportionate rates. The far right is not the cause of racism in Britain, and it is opportunism, plain and simple, to say so. So, we cannot understand what the Spartacist position on stand up to racism actually is, because you do not put the primary emphasis on state racism, which indicates to us you do not understand imperialism. Your article, after the racist riots 2 years ago, has one vague sentence saying the workers' movement must defend refugees and oppose deportations. That's the only sentence really referring to state racism. You've said in that article that you have no interest in supporting immigration quotas. Then you go on to say, but you have no interest in supporting the current high immigration policy. This is a confused position. The most concrete thing that is put forward that I've seen is that there needs to be mass trade union defence, but really this is a laughable position that is not based in really any sort of reality. You've said yourself that the trade unions failed to defend themselves. So why would the pro-immigration unions defend migrants and ethnic minorities from attack? And most importantly, ethnic minority communities are more than capable of defending themselves. Mass trade union defence has nothing to do with confronting state racism. So let me ask, do the Spartacists recognise that immigration controls in imperialist Britain are inherently racist? Do you oppose them unconditionally without making concessions to people who support them? Should we be fighting them? Do you even think it's important? And if you don't think it's a priority for fighting for socialism, how are you any different from Stand Up to Racism, who you claim to oppose? And finally, do you really think that the trade unions are going to be the basis for organising opposition to state racism, organising opposition to migration and the police? Because quite frankly, it is impossible to work out those answers based on what you've written.
Thank you. Do we have another speaker for the Spartacist League? Julia?
It's not me.
Oh,
So I'll come up there.
it's Haidar, and one from the RCG getting ready. What's your name? Janelle?
Apologies in advance. I'm not good with technology at any level, and so bear with me. I'm speaking in support of the Spartacist League's positions. Just to give just brief background, I've not long since retired from the railway, where I spent many years as a RMT trade union rep. So that's the social milieu I come from. That was my reality. My reality wasn't a petty bourgeois bubble, which I think so much of the ostensibly revolutionary left are caught up in. And if being determines consciousness, I think that's quite instructive. To speak to the core of the debate, what is to be done to defeat imperialism? I think the basic answer to that is a mobilisation of the international working class against all imperialist, capitalist, blood-sucking regimes. To fight imperialism, there needs to be an international alliance, a combat alliance of the international working class. And that's what I'm talking about, the working class. They have the power to defeat imperialism. Strikes against arms shipments to genocidal Israeli regime slaughtering the Palestinian masses. The imperialist outrage against Iran. It's the international working class. They're the ones that will defeat it. They have the social power to defeat it. Strikes, real, hard strikes against these imperialist slaughters. Now, we talk about And I'm not saying this is easy, this is not easy, but this is the reality of where the struggle goes. And it has to be a struggle against the existing rotten pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist misleadership of the trade unions. And how is that done? That's done by communists actually being in the real world and getting involved, getting their hands dirty in trade unions and doing that in that intransigent opposition against the existing misleaders, against those bureaucratic aristocrats of labour. You fight in reality, and you're relevant to the workers, you're part of the class, and that's how you steal a new leadership. And it's a new leadership that can build the unions from the hollowed out rumps that they've been, and I absolutely include my union, the R&T, constantly have postured on the left of the trade union movement, but the amount of unorganised workers working the railways, non-unionised, and it's that alternative leadership, that communist leadership, building that intransigent struggle that can reinvigorate the unions, that can organise the unorganised, and that's where social power lies. That's the whole reason for being a communist. You're fighting working class combatants. That's what you are. And it comes back, and Vincent quoted it, in terms of the third Congress of the Communist International. You know, I believe in transforming the unions into revolutionary mass organisations of the proletariat, and that's where it lies. You know, get out of this petty bourgeois studenty milieu that the left are trapped in. Go into where the workers are, and all those unorganised and the lower layers, if you will, of the working class of the RCG speak very, very eloquently and very, very passionately for. It's with a communist leadership in the trade unions that those workers will be brought into the unions, and the unions will be transformed into fighting organisations of the proletariat. We're communists, we're working class partisans. Forget the petty bourgeoisie.
Hello, I'm Tanel. I'm from the RCG. The sparks in your writing and based on your opening statement, you put a lot of effort into distancing yourselves from what you call the liberal left, and you reiterate that you stand staunchly against their leadership. However, much of your analysis fails to answer why many of these organisations hold the politics that they do. Furthermore, by assigning them the term liberal, you overwrite the class basis of their politics. The core problem, as we've already stated, with much of the left's leadership's politics is that they reject the concept of the labour aristocracy. They reject what Lenin identified as a connection between imperialism and the stratification of the working class. The RCG has long recognised this as an important analytical tool for understanding why these left organisations hold such a politics, and this is evident in the numerous interventions we've done up and down the country, such as with your party, which was quite successful, by the way, and at the Together Alliance March. However, you tend to write them off as liberals, and you even claim in issue 257 of Warhammer that they must ditch their liberal politics. But if you understood why Lenin regarded this connection between imperialism and the division in the working class with such importance, you'd understand that they have to cling to their liberalism. It's in their interest to remain opportunists. Their politics are not a choice as you frame them. They are a reactionary survival mechanism purposed to preserving the privileges of the petty bourgeois strata. By rejecting this division in the working class, organisations like the SWP can treat the working class as this homogenous mass that can band together to defeat the enemy, which they default to being reform and the far right. And for all that you try to distance yourselves from them, your analysis, your conclusions are much the same as theirs. And the consequence of this is that we meet the racist imperialist British state with weak resistance. Again, bribery by super profits converted a section of the working class into watchdogs of capitalism and, crucially, corruptors of the labour movement. This is the social layer from which liberal politics is birthed and maintained. It is in their material interests to defend imperialism. We, the RCG, explicitly recognise this as opportunism, and that to reject this is to adopt a position that is divorced from reality, and as Lenin put it, deception by means of abstractions. You also failed to assess the consequences of your position by claiming that these organisations must ditch their liberal politics. You assume some kind of possibility that they can be brought back to the working class, but you do this without an analysis of the material conditions that might make that possible. This means that you default to the far right, you default to fighting reform, who, mind you, currently have no control over the state apparatus. The Labour Party does. I can only be led to assume that you would allow these opportunists, you would allow these agents of the state into the labour movement so long as they shed their liberal layers on their way in. And this is as false as it is dangerous. Again, these organisations are forced to make alliances with the enemy. They are forced to make alliances with the state. And this transforms them into a more proximal and thus more dangerous enemy. They are more dangerous precisely because of the substantial presence and trust that they have with the working class, which the state relies on because it cannot amass that on its own. They are also corroborated by the tools of the bourgeoisie, such as the media. Armed with both, it's no wonder we have yet to see a socialist movement in Britain. And this is doubly so when organisations, such as yourselves, fail to treat them with the severity that they must be treated with. So my question is that if you cannot assess exactly what the stakes are for the opportunists of the liberal left, as you keep calling them, how do you expect to defend the working class from their deception? Precisely because you underestimate these organisations' desperation to retain their privileges, and you underestimate their bourgeois backing. That is why you constantly default to the trade unions. And I would like to say that you said that we do not understand the contradictions in the class struggle and that we only think in black and white. I would like to say that I fail to see where you're going with this critique, because are black and white not the greatest visualization of contradiction? So clearly we understand it more than you do.
Yes, so now we're going to ask any independents to indicate if they would want to speak. In other words, speakers that are not aligned with either the RCG or the Spartacist League. And something I forgot to mention earlier, people who have already spoken can come in for a second time, on RCG speaker or SL speakers if they so wish. But we're going to now give the independents a chance. We're going to take one independent and one RCG. So we have two shows. Can we take two independents? Oh, Nathaniel. We have three independents. So let's take this comrade here and say, Nathaniel, did you show? And we'll try and catch you later, comrade, over there, okay? I didn't catch your name. Owen, I did catch your name, yes, sorry. Okay, Owen, will be followed by Nathaniel, and then we go back to the SLRCG thing, okay?
I just want to say first, I've been to a couple of local meetings with the RCG in Brighton. I'm not a member as such yet, but my comments are mostly questions and clarifications, maybe an intervention or two. It's been a really long time since I've heard the term social chauvinism, first of all, so I just wondered if the members of the Spartacist League could clarify what you meant, and also perhaps expand on what you meant by moralism as well. in terms of the speech from the RCG, I was also wondering the phrase that I have the most difficulty with is I think you used, sorry, what's your name? Cass. You talked about explaining to the masses. You used this phrase at one point, and maybe this is just something from like a British perspective, but I find that the Chinese politics in particular, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, are almost like it's almost a complete blank spot in British politics and revolution and left-wing politics in particular. After Maoism, what Maoism almost forces us to do is completely rethink our relationship in terms of power, the relationships of leaders, in quote, leaders to workers and so on. And it seems to me that it's a lesson that the British left hasn't really learned. Like when Mao talks about differentiating between contradictions amongst the people and contradictions between the people and the state and so on. And how he maintains that even within socialism or communism, the bourgeois reforms itself inside the Communist Party. And finally, I just wanted to raise a point about, like, in this country as well, in the 1980s, like prior to the 80s, in the 70s, you had huge protests on the street by workers from all backgrounds, and a real sense, like, influences like what changed in the 1980s was the right, the conservatives in particular, completely, by the end of the 80s, had hegemonized identity politics. And this is why you saw those adverts in newspapers in the mid-1980s in which black London citizens, it was like the Conservatives rebranding project. He's not black, he's British. And in this way, the right, by the end of the 80s, had completely hegemonized. I'm not even sure if identity politics is the way we should be thinking about it anyway, but I'd just like to point out that this was a battle that was very much won by the right and is sometimes still being won today.
Thank you. Nathaniel?
Hi there, Nathaniel, independent, Islington Photo Brand. I guess I have two sort of questions, given this is on what should we do to oppose imperialism. And I guess it's on the sort of practical successes of what both approaches seem to have taken. So for the Spartacists, I guess my question is, by organising within the existing trade union movement, what have you been able to accomplish sort of opposing imperialism within that, fighting against the things like the ongoing genocide in Palestine, and then to the RCP, CG, whatever. Sorry.
We'll defend you guys on that one.
There seems to be a focus on organising the unorganised, and again, I would sort of like to ask what successes have happened there, and sort of particularly anything that is enduring beyond like a single issue campaign. Thanks.
Okay, that's for the independents. Do we have, do any of the speakers want to come back at this point in the discussion? Or we can go to Spartacist League, RCG from the floor. Is there any? Okay, let's have, we'll have Josh, and followed by Josh for the Spartacist League, and then we can take one more speaker from the RCG. Sarah?
All right.
There you are, Sarah. Okay.
I'm Josh. I'm a supporter of the Spartacist League.
I thought to myself a joke on the way here. It's a little bit, but like, I'm the devil, okay? I'm the devil. I'm an American union worker who was employed for 18 years in a municipal job. I mean, really, this is labor aristocracy to an extent, okay, to an extent. But I want to get into that to point out what the extent is. We wrote an article recently that had the phrase, relatively privileged sector of the working class. And this is where I think the difference with us lies on the question of the labor aristocracy. R&T workers in the City of London are a relatively privileged sector of the working class. No bones about it. Their living conditions, their pay, their benefits, their work hours are all worse than they were 30 years ago. And it is a result of the fact that the RMT has not gone and organized the unorganized workers in rail. People who are working all kinds of horrid shifts with no safety conditions, paid half as much, etc., etc., etc. A lot of them were East European workers. Now that's somewhat changed. British imperialism is plays with its immigration codes, etc., okay? So what was the article? It was an argument both to organize these workers and to undercut Mick Lynch in the RMT, to point out to RMT workers that their own interests were involved in organizing these unorganized workers, okay? That's what we mean. In either or leaves half the question out there, okay? But I wanted to get to actually Comrade Kantz's comments, okay? Because I think that there are important questions in here. How do we approach the question of immigration? You are absolutely right that the British state is racist to the core. Whatever they do is going to be to serve the City of London. It is never, ever going to be to serve the working class, black, white, brown, etc., immigrant, native, etc. It is going to be to serve the City of London, okay? That is their immigration policy, and it changes. It goes up and down. They let more in, they take people out, they do all of this back and forth. What does it mean to organize the unorganized? And this is the question of how to fight racism, I think, at its core. They take a bunch of migrant workers and they stick them in broken down cities that used to be industrial centers in England, and they pit migrants against the native population. Those migrants are held away from being able to work, are treated like crap, are stuck in these hotels. They are completely alienated from society. And the local residents see them as though they're getting all this free stuff, etc., and it drives this racist crap up. And it is a very conscious policy in most of the country. How do we as communists fight it? Well, what do we believe integration into society really is? The ability to work, the right to actually be a part of the social fabric of society in a fundamental way. The fight for the jobs that have been lost and destroyed by Labour and Tory governments absolutely across this country. In deindustrialization in 30 years, in places like Hull, okay? In Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. All of these things in this disunited, in this racist trap of nations that is the United Kingdom too, okay? You very rightly point out Ireland. One of the things I very much admire about the RCG comrades, always the independence of Ireland, all right? To take these workers that have been thrown out and left behind in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions in Britain, also the demand for jobs is the crucial demand. The thing that's going to undercut all of this in this country is a common struggle for the benefit of the working class as it exists and the working class as it needs to exist among all of these held out of work. And that is what will undercut and actually integrate this. All right, so that's the question of immigration. It's how we view it fundamentally. Because outside of that, you're looking for one or another policy of the capitalists to fix it or one another force. I want to get to one last thing. I think that there is somewhat of a difference of how we view what's going on now, and I do want to point it out. I would never say that you guys don't take on labor. And I think if you look at our history, you would know the same thing about us. Our principal intervention into Palestine movement when the elections were coming up was to say dump Starmer for Palestine. It was for us to call out the Labour Party as the ones that were going to win and keep supporting the Israeli state in America, against Palestine. Okay. But like when you raise Minneapolis, it raises something. something is shifting in the world. The problem the liberals have now, and the left, which got too comfortable with them, I'll have to give it up to.
Oh. Okay, Sarah, for the
I'm Sarah from the RCG. My comrade Cass has very usefully put forward our position on imperialism and our understanding of the tasks of communists in imperialist countries. Communists must offer their unconditional support for the struggle of national liberation movements against British imperialist domination and against national oppression. This is because we understand that we actually have the same goals, the defeat of British imperialism. So we unconditionally support the Palestinian people in all of their attempts to dismantle the settler colony of Israel set up by US and British imperialism as an outpost to defend their interests in the Middle East. The Al-Aqsa flood operation of October 2023, led by the Palestinian resistance, sent British imperialism into a crisis which it has been unable to recover from. Our role is to deepen that crisis and smash British imperialism once and for all. The Spartacist League doesn't have such an understanding of imperialism. The speaker before me mentioned the slogan that they've organized around, the Starmer to defend Palestine. This isn't any different from all the various left groups who go on about the so-called Starmer government, right? A formulation which in practice attributes labor Zionism exclusively to Keir Starmer, and which covers up for over 100 years of Labour Party Zionism. Would the Labour Party be any different if it was led by Wes Streeting, or if it was led by David Lammy, or when he was leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who threw the Palestinian people under the bus, right? This is an idealist position, and we have to be clear about that. In your article, No NATO, No Greens, No Zionism, you see that the current state of Israel is incompatible with the Palestinians' right to self-determination, and in another article, you speak about how the Palestinian people should pursue a strategy of proletarian internationalism which would orient its actions towards splitting the Israeli nation along class lines, paralyzing its military apparatus and breaking it from within, and you've reiterated that today. This is hardly different from what the RCP, the Socialist Party, or even Socialist Alternative say about Palestine. The reality is that all of Israeli society materially benefits from the occupation of the Palestinian people, and that includes the Israeli working class. It cannot play a progressive role until the state of Israel, which guarantees these privileges, is itself smashed. This position isn't any different from those who argue for common struggle between Republican and loyalist sections of the working class in the occupied 6 counties, ignoring reality, which is that their material interests are completely opposed. And I don't need to say it again, but remember Lenin, under imperialism, the concept of an undifferentiated working class is an abstraction. You further suggest that a 2-state solution between Palestine and Israel is possible, speaking of the democratic right of the Israeli Jewish people to live as a nation in Israel/Palestine from Workers' Hammer supplement of October 2023. This is a reactionary position. Israel is an outpost of imperialism. Its existence relies on the extermination of the Palestinian people. It doesn't have a right to exist, and Israelis don't have a right to exist in Israel. The Palestinians do have a right to self-determination, to reclamation of their land, by whatever means necessary. The Spartacist position on Palestine is not only idealist, it betrays the Palestinian struggle in favor of abstract, unrealistic notions of solidarity between racist oppressors and those they oppress. Lenin was clear in 1916, national self-determination is the same as the struggle for complete national liberation, for complete independence, against annexation, and socialists cannot, without ceasing to be socialists, reject the struggle in whatever form, right down to an uprising or war. So if the Spartacists are socialists, why won't you support the Palestinian liberation struggle and the communists in the resistance?
Okay, so Vincent will come back for the SL and someone for... Well, we're just taking them as we go.
The summary is
No.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So how many speakers?
Well, we don't have to limit the number of speakers because we still have time.
Okay.
Are that agreeable? Yes. So you're not taking someone else's time. And when we come to an independent, if I can have another, if I can see another RCG speaker to follow Vincent, so that will be Robert, and then I can take an independent. Yeah. So I'll take Sean after that.
Right. Just quickly to come back, I think this was quite demagogic. We have a clear position against the two-state solution. We are for a one unified Palestine and for the destruction of the Zionist state as well. It's written in an article. I'm not familiar with the particular formulation you quoted, we can see, but we've attacked left group like the Socialist Party, who is for like Israel socialist and Palestine socialist. We reject those things and we are with the resistance. We have multiple articles about this. So we do have a disagreement on the Israeli working class. We can talk about this maybe later. I want to just in general, where the discussion is going and where are the fundamental disagreements. The comrades of the RCG are insisting a lot that we reject the theory of the labor aristocracy and that we do not share this. But this is untrue, as my comrade Elizabeth has said. Of course there's a labor aristocracy. Of course we've never denied that. That's basic Leninism, right? A top layer of the working class which is bought off. However, I believe what the RCG ends up doing is that it abuses this theory to justify abstention. Because comrades are talking about the labor aristocracy. Well, who are we talking about? Like, is the nurse going to a food bank a labor aristocrat? Is the RT train driver who's overworked, might make a good wage, but works like 80 hours a week, a labor aristocrat? The comments never really explain exactly. We try to approach things concretely, and what is the political position of people, And working in the trade unions requires working in every sort of layers where you do have more conservative people, but where you do have people who are quite open to revolutionary ideas, including in the trade unions. Because I would know for many workers, including in the public sector, life is fucking hard. So we have to be a bit concrete about this. We have to leave the field of abstraction about who's a labor aristocrat and who isn't. Because in the end, it can just quickly become an excuse for not doing work where communist work is deeply needed. Second, it actually clicked on me listening to comrades of the RCG. You're saying that a split has already occurred. That's false, comrades. Is the working class led by a mass communist party against the reformists, as Lenin was writing about in 1920? I don't think so. Workers are either apathetic or they actually look to Reform UK, and a small layer looks to Eddie Dempsey, Sharon Graham, the Labour Party. The workers are following the social chauvinists. So a split hasn't occurred, comrade. The working class is very well tied to the social chauvinists. It just clicked on me that this is actually the theoretical error of the RCG, and maybe what I should have hammered a little more. You are saying the split is done, so no need to go into the trade unions. We're saying, no, the split has to be fought for in the trade unions today, in the Labour Party today. And just look at reality. We'll know when the split is done when there's a mass communist party that actually emerges from social democracy. Just quickly on state racism, I hope I'll have time. There's a lot of confusion among RCG comrades. We can work to make our position better, but basically our thing is quite simple. To respond to your question, Katsai, yes, we consider every single immigration law to be racist. There's no progressive policy about immigration from the British ruling class. It's impossible, because whatever they do is for their interest. They repress the immigrants when they don't need them, they bring them as cheap labor when they do. That's it. That's what immigration, the role it plays. Now, the reason we don't constantly bang on this question is because the problem for the socialist movement today isn't so much to say every immigration law is racist and we have to oppose state racism, which by the way we oppose, and we do agree with the RCG that the liberals, they never look at state racism. You're correct to point this out. But the main problem the socialist movement confronts is that working class people whose living standards are getting destroyed are looking towards the right, in large part because the left, particularly but not only on the question of immigration, has a totally liberal position. That's why we oppose stand up to racism, or we're critical of its strategy. Well, very critical. It's here, what's the strategy of stand up to racism? Let's go into some town, deindustrialized town, where there's been protest against a hotel, a deindustrialized town we've never been in and will never go again. Go there, Packard refugees are welcome here, call everyone a racist who does not like this situation, and then go home. And then in collaboration with Labour Party politicians as well, as you obviously know. But we also criticize that this is a liberal approach to the question of immigration. We do need to defend immigrants. We need to fight for the unity of workers, British-born workers and foreign-born workers. But you're not going to do this with liberal politics that scold people, that doesn't look at material fact, that just takes what's in your heart. Show me what's in your heart. Do you love immigrants in your heart or not? This isn't a Marxist approach. You have to base it on material reality. Workers have to understand they have a material interest to defend immigrants.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Hi, Destiny from the RCG. So you've spoken a lot about Cuba. As we know, Cuba is politically isolated and economically strangled by the US blockade, and it's continued to defend its socialist project, organized through state planning and around social need rather than private profit. Universal healthcare, education, and mass political participation, alongside an internationalism expressed through its military support in Angola, medical brigades, and unwavering solidarity with Palestine, Venezuela, and other anti-imperialist struggles, demonstrates the revolution's enduring socialist and anti-imperialist character. But this reality is systematically obscured in much of the opportunist left's coverage, and in doing so, they reproduce the same ideological playbook as the liberal press, like The Guardian, by stripping Cuba of its colonial and imperialist context, erasing and minimizing its achievements, and refusing to engage with the Cuban leadership's perspectives and statements. And if you were to read what they're saying, you'd see that they openly speak about the contradictions on the island and what they're doing to try and mitigate that. And the result is a profoundly backward distortion which obscures the effects of the blockade and ignores the way in which the state and the masses work together through continuous grassroots dialogue and cooperation to develop diverse strategies to mitigate the worsening effects of sanctions and to improve conditions on the island. And what this approach reveals is a fundamentally different understanding of socialism itself. Much of the liberal left reduces socialism to nationalisation or state ownership, treating property relations as sufficient in themselves, whereas we understand socialism as working class power achieved through the dictatorship of the proletariat, a state where the working class holds political power and directs society in its own interests against capital. So in the Spartacist League's recent article on the Nuestra America Flotilla, it follows the opportunist line. The most recent escalations in Cuba are reduced to humanitarian crisis, with suffering foregrounded. You use personal testimonies of blackouts, empty pharmacies, a lack of medicine. You say that the infrastructure is decrepit and go on to describe it as looking like it had been hit by an earthquake or a bomb. And all the while the blockade is pushed into the background. When talking about the private shops multiplying, when island-wide blackouts are happening, or when you talk about Hotel Nacional, where drinks can be purchased with dollars, you essentially collapse the complex contradictions into a moral critique of so-called authoritarianism, or what you guys regarded yourselves as a Stalinist bureaucracy, therefore abandoning the material analysis in favour of abstract democratic norms detached from class struggle. Last year we interviewed Mariela Castro, and she said in the interview, Cuba is a living revolutionary society. We're dynamic and in motion, not static as some claim. Your position isn't an isolated position, but it's the standard line of the wider liberal and opportunist left. And it raises the fundamental question, do you support socialism where people are actually fighting to defend it and to build it under imperialist attack, or only when it exists as an abstract ideal free from any contradiction or struggle? For communists in Britain, this reflects a broader question of the struggle for socialism. Britain's an imperialist country tied to the US and complicit in sustaining the illegal blockade against Cuba. So any weakening of Cuba is a weakening of the only living, breathing socialist project at the moment. If you cannot defend socialism on an island that has defied all odds and where millions of people are continuing to struggle, fight and defend socialism, then what socialism are you fighting for? What is this socialist project that you will be fighting for?
Our next speaker is Sean as an independent. Then we will take an SL speaker, which will be Julia, followed by Robert, yes, for the RCG.
Hi comrades, I'm Sean. I'm a member of International Socialist Alternative Revolutionary, in parentheses. I was just expelled from Socialist Alternative here in Britain for defense of Palestine, for defense of Iran, for proclaiming no support to the Democratic Party of the US, no support to pro-imperialist labor leaders here in Britain like Sharon Graham. We took a principled stance. We still have comrades that are fighting inside Socialist Alternative, but that's what led to my expulsion. We want to fight to be reinstated, to continue the fight, to exacerbate the contradiction in the ranks of Socialist Alternative. So just speaking for myself, for my organization, I want to register agreement with pretty much all of what the Spartacist League has laid out today, but I want to speak on the questions of Palestine particularly. So on points of agreement, there's no disagreement on the question of a right for the Palestinian resistance to bear arms, a right for the Palestinian resistance to negotiate with the imperialists, and a right to engage in struggle. In fact, arms is necessary and negotiations are also necessary. You can't abandon all tools. I also agree with the RCG on calling out the treachery of the Palestinian Authority, their role in being totally ingratiated within the Palestine Solidarity Campaign here in Britain, and the whole labor bureaucracy, and the defense of Iran as well. But I think here's the problem, we can't just talk about defense, unconditional support. We have to also articulate what is the path towards actually winning a free Palestine, towards actually advancing the struggle of the resistance. So the thing is, we need to look at the contradictions that exist in the resistance itself. So Hamas is basically leadership, and Hamas itself is divided. There's a wing that's based in Qatar, that's closer towards international diplomats, towards Turkey, stuff like that. And there's a wing in Gaza, which favors armed struggle and confrontation. These things may have changed now in the last year or so. But both wings have serious allusions in international law. That is, in the international laws of US imperialism. I'm quoting from Yahya Sinwar, who's on the more militant wing. He said in 2021, we can force the occupation to take one of two choices, either to apply international law and respect international resolutions, establishing a Palestinian state on occupied land from 1967, including Jerusalem, or we put this occupation in a state of conflict with international will and isolate it violently to end its integration into the region and the world. This strategy is to convince US imperialism to change its approach to Israel, to isolate Israel from the rest of the world. His strategy is not to beat US imperialism. And so this program is itself incapable of harnessing the forces required to advance the resistance because it's not explicitly a revolutionary program. The struggle since the launch of Tufan al-Aqsa has not ended in victory. Of course, it's not an entire defeat. The resistance is not entirely gone, and we should seek to defend and advance the resistance from where it is now. But it's certainly not in a better position than it was before. Half of Gaza is still occupied. There's still, basic forms of famine in Gaza. There's still bombings of Lebanon. They're expanding the war on Iran. But of course, Israel and the US are finding themselves in a bit of a trap. But it's not exactly great for Iran, Gaza, and Lebanon either. But we can see that this broader strategy of orienting to international law, even with armed struggle, is not fundamentally distinct from the strategy of the PSC, which is to get the Labour Party and British imperialism to change their minds on Israel, to get them to isolate Israel, which makes it quite easy for the trade union bureaucracy to sign on to whatever the PSC puts forward without actually mobilizing the working class for Palestine and an offensive against the bosses. The point is that if we want to actually wage this split and make this split, we need to show that to advance the existing conditions of the working class here in Britain or the US or wherever in the imperialist world, to advance us from where we are now, we have to side with Palestine. Because a defeat for the IDF, a defeat for the US military in the Middle East, is a defeat for the boss's army abroad and a defeat for the boss's army at home, which is why we must take a stance to defend them. But in doing so, we can't fight for simply isolating Israel from imperialism. We have to fight imperialism itself through the working class. And that's how we fight for advancing the resistance, not simply just laying cover to when they actually are incapable of advancing the struggle themselves. So I appeal to comrades, the debate here is not whether or not we defend the resistance. The debate is what strategy can we take to advance it from where it is now. And that can't be separated from a struggle within the imperialist countries to fight against the trade union bureaucracy that ties the interests of workers to their class enemy. We need to make that split happen, and we can't do that by covering for misleadership, even with resistance. Any comments? I'll take out my literature back here if you want to check it out.
Now we will call on Julia for the Spartacist League, followed by Robert for the RCG.
Hi, I'm Julia, Spartacist. I just wanted to address the comments about Cuba, because that's, to me, it's always been a strong point of the RCG, that you are staunchly in defense of the Cuban Revolution, where a lot of the left will simply say it's capitalist and write it off and not do anything to defend it. So I want to say where we're coming from, where we agree and where we disagree on this question. Just like you, we have defended Cuba since its inception. Where the difference is between our two organizations is whether or not we support the Cuban regime, or, like in our case, we have criticisms of the Cuban regime. And to me, this is not a question of what label you give it. It's true that we've called it a Stalinist bureaucracy. But let's look at Cuba today. Okay, everybody knows, if you switch the news on, that Cuba is hanging on the brink. It is, the US has basically starved Cuba into, it is trying to starve Cuba into submission. So when you look at what is happening, the question is, are the policies of the Cuban leadership helping to defend the revolution, or are they actually undermining it? That really is the question. And the same question can be raised with reference to Venezuela, because you think Venezuela is socialist. We think Maduro. We think we have a lot more criticisms of that, but the question here is there's a lot to defend in the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. Are the policies of the Venezuelan government aiding in the imperialist struggle, or are they, on the contrary, hindering the imperialist struggle? Now, what is happening right now in Cuba is that the Cuban government is currently negotiating with the US imperialists and putting all its faith in the fact that Trump is going to come up with a deal that they can accept. But Trump's deal is the Gusano's deal. It is communists out, capitalists in. That is what has to be fought right now in Cuba. So we can't do that by denying that the Cuban government's negotiations with the US are directly undermining the Cuban Revolution. I've been there recently. Our team went as along with your comrades as part of the Nuestra America flotilla, and it was very clear that that there's a lot of anger in Cuba, not just at the blockade, which is obviously the most important question. The US is responsible for the situation in Cuba, but there's also immense anger among the Cuban normal people in Cuba over the policies that the regime has adopted in the last decades, and those include opening the country up to tourism at the expense of the local population. So when the tourism industry collapsed, many people just completely lost their livelihood. And the other thing, which is a huge, huge source of resentment in Cuba, is the dollarization of the economy. They've introduced, basically you can't buy anything in Cuba except for very basic, like rice, pay for your electricity, really basics, unless you have dollars or euros. But the population doesn't earn in dollars or euros. So that creates an enormous gap between those who have families in the United States or other imperialist countries who can send them dollars and euros, and the rest of the population. Why is this a problem? Because when we were in Cuba, we found that the Cuban population, the people we talked to, were very worried about, will the Cuban people actually mobilize to defend the Cuban Revolution in the face of a possible counter-revolution impending? And the problem is the opinion was really divided. The young people said, we don't see anything to defend here. We grew up in total deprivation, starvation, poverty, and they actually blame the Cuban government more than the Americans. They're wrong about that. But we do have to take that into account, is that there are problems with what the Cuban bureaucracy is pursuing. Similarly, Venezuela. We agree with the RCG in defending the Venezuela, including Maduro, against the attack by the United States and the kidnapping of its sitting president. However, the policies of the Venezuelan government are directly undermining the anti-imperialist struggle, and we have to be honest about that too. They uniquely, or almost uniquely, have the means to send oil to Cuba to break the current dire situation there. But they're refusing to do so because they're collaborating with the US government. We can't pass that over. We have to counterpose a socialist strategy to that. And that really is where the difference is between the two of us. Now I'll finish on one comment on the anti-imperialist struggle in Britain, because I think it's a credit to the RCG that you do have the appetite to organize amongst the oppressed. You do it well. You organize, a lot of demonstrations in support of prisoners, minorities, things that you refer to, and I think you do a good job at it. But the question is, do you think we can actually defeat British imperialism solely with the oppressed without any kind of alliance with the bulk of the working class? I think no.
I must confess myself to being very impressed by the Spartacist League. Last time, we've got a strategy there. Ireland, well, we would have had a strategy there. We've got a strategy for Cuba. We've got strategies for the whole world, it seems, from such a tiny organization. Spends a lot of time devising strategies for other revolutionary struggles. And that's an interesting feature of the rest of the left, which you affect to despise and oppose. Because they've also always got strategies for these countries. And those strategies always involve the same thing. In relation to Cuba, well, really it wasn't a socialist revolution. It will always suffer from defects. And no, there's no need for us to engage with the processes that have been taking place in Cuba. Listen to what was said by the previous speaker, right? Not about the problems with the collapse of the Soviet Union and why it was necessary for the Cuban government to take certain steps, such as reintroducing tourism. No, but they've got a strategy in relation to Venezuela. We're quite clear on these questions. We, in Britain, in an imperialist country, have absolutely no right to tell people how to organize their own revolutionary struggles. It's a moral position, if you like. Actually, it's a working class moral position, because what we've always recognized is there is solidarity. If there is solidarity from an imperialist country for a struggle for liberation, as there was for Ireland, right, by showing that solidarity and practicing it, you are giving support to the radical revolutionary wing of the liberation movement, because the reactionary wing would say there's no hope from the imperialist country. And that's exactly the strategy that we adopted in relation both to the South African liberation struggle, to the Irish liberation struggle. And let's remember that the entire left ran away in 1981. Ran away. They didn't just say horrible things, they ran away from the struggle. They were not to be seen, such as the crisis that the hunger strike had involved. And in relation to Palestine, yes, you look at who we quote about how we express the interests of the Palestinian people. We're cultivating relations with the radical, the revolutionary wing of the Palestine liberation struggle. We're not going to attack. We're not going to criticize. We're not going to condemn any aspect of the resistance. It's not our right so to do. Our responsibility, our right is only to fight against British imperialism in that regard. And therefore I'm alarmed when comrades from the Spartacist League use language which actually is a concession to imperialist culture. There is no such thing as Northern Ireland. There is no such thing as the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom exists only in statistical books. It does not exist because it actually denies the right of the Irish people to self-determination. And least of all is there something called American imperialism, right? There is only US imperialism and US citizens, because my wife is Chilean and she's American and she's not for imperialism, and neither is Chile. So don't use that language. It is a cultural language. Now I'm going to finish because there have been one article that I've written in the past. I'm actually quite proud of the articles I've written on Corbyn. He says they're disgusting. Well, yeah, they're very, very harsh and very hard and quite properly. So in relation to the trade unions, let's go through this very carefully. We think, we know from our experience that a revolutionary movement will start outside of the trade unions. It will involve, quite possibly, trade unionists, of course, but it will start outside where there is no restriction of the sort that is imposed by anti-trade union laws, by the so-called bureaucracy, the leadership, right? It's going to be, it happened in 1970s. There was a revolutionary movement. Now, that is going to have an impact quite possibly on the struggle within the trade unions. We, of course, stand for trade union struggle against the ruling class, against the capitalists. But we understand the character of the membership of the trade unions, where 40% are aged over 50. I tell you, comrades, I know I'm old, but I think that if you're over 50, you're not the material of which a revolutionary movement is going to be built. It's going to be based on young people. And that's what I think we have shown during the course of this afternoon, as young people, young comrades have spoken for the RCG.
Yeah, so let me just see if there are an indication of someone at least who has not spoken yet, who does want to speak, and we'll take a speaker from SLRCG. And should we ask for one more independent or not? No more independent. Okay, one SL and one RCG. So we'll have, which order? Ray, followed by comrade beside you. Law, okay.
Ray, that side. I think Comrade Vincent pointed to something that's actually really crucial here. Has there been already the split in the working class? And I think that it relates directly to Britain, the role of communists, the Palestine movement, stand up to racism, and the trade unions. So one of the comrades there asked, was criticizing our role in the Palestine struggle and said, well, what you're saying, with your Marxist position on Israel, supposedly, and everything else is just like what people like the RCP say, right? Your criticisms of Starmer. Well, the whole left talks about how Starmer's a rat and this kind of thing. How are you any different? But what the left did not do was to fight in that movement to break it from Starmer. That was the key thing. And the RCG ends up doing the same thing as the RCP, not struggling in the movement for a clear break from those liberal labor right politics that chains the Palestine movement to a position of helplessness in fighting imperialism. We've got to break those chains. For stand up to racism, it's the same thing. So I think you asked about, well, what is our attitude to stand up to racism? What's our criticism? The criticism is the same damn thing that the SWP and everybody else in the leadership of that movement connects the defense of immigrant rights and the fight against racism to what? To the bourgeois liberals, to any labor politician who will sign their their platform and to the trade union bureaucracy that's the single most important factor for why the working class does not act in a real way to defend immigrants. And what the comrade said earlier about what he's doing in his trade union shows a way to fight against that. But again, the RCG, the problem is not that you're saying the right things about stand up to racism and about the Palestine movement and about the liberals and about the labor rights. But like with the trade unions, we need you in there fighting with us to break those movements from those forces. And that's where I think our real difference is in terms of advancing those struggles. Now, the other thing I wanted to make a point about, though, is about the trade unions. So, okay, you're saying you'd be with the trade unions and struggle and all that, but actually, to what purpose? And I want to link that to this understanding of British imperialism, actually. British imperialism is not what it used to be, right? It has been decaying for about 100 years, actually. Think about it. Like every other imperialist leader in Europe, it went to the White House as dogs to Trump to try to get the bone, right? One after the other. Who's calling the shots is really obvious. It's Trump, not the British imperialists, okay? But what does that mean? The decaying conditions of the British Empire, the decrepit condition of capitalism here, is both fueling the right wing, which is, by the way, about to take control of the racist capitalist state. So the fight against reform is not separate from what you're saying about the racist capitalist state in Britain, because of the bankruptcy of the organized left to fight them. You know, but those same conditions, the same decrepitude of the British imperialist system actually creates material conditions that should throw together the white workers who've been dispossessed with the immigrant workers, with blacks in Britain, and with everybody who's got a stake in fighting against that decay, for fighting for their lives. So look, if you're a migrant from Somalia and you arrive in these shores and you see dock workers at Felixstowe making pretty good money, they look like labor aristocrats. But from the point of view of the British ruling class, in their decrepitude, the union that organizes those workers stands in their way of their class interests, right? And they're going to say at some point, okay, you trade union leaders, you keep control of your workers because we're going to go after them. And if you can't, we're going to smash them. And that's what Thatcher's attitude was toward the steel workers and crucially the miners in the mid-'80s for the same damn reason. That creates conditions of class struggle. The question is, will you be in there, in the trade unions, fighting for a revolutionary answer against those leaders or outside? Our pitch is to go in there with us and fight.
Paul for the RCG.
Okay, let me just turn to this question of, I might say, fetishizing trade unions, right? As we've heard today, 20% of the workers in Britain are in trade unions. So what are you going to do about the other 80% of the working class? Of the 20% of the workers in trade unions, 50% of them are working for the state, for local government or central government. They all have good pensions. They're relatively privileged. If we look further into these statistics, which I won't go much further into them, you'll find there are a very large proportion who are graduates, who've got debts, who are not going to cause any trouble, right? Now, so we'll put that 20% aside for one moment. The comrade at the front works in the trade unions and he knows how difficult it is, and I can assure you, comrade, I'm very sympathetic to you and the hard work you carry out. And you've pointed out very clearly that you face a leadership which obstructs you all of the time. I don't know how that actually works when we have one of your colleagues at the front saying there's no split in the working class. So you better sort out your argument between yourselves, all right? Now, let's go on to some other points here. The question of Palestine is a fact that in your newspaper you do have Israel/Palestine at one point, so you also ought to clear that up. It's not surprising that some of my comrades have said they can't read your newspaper and make much sense of a lot of it. It is very difficult read, and frankly I'm very sympathetic to you. As an editor you must have a very difficult job. We get to the point with Hamas, And I read an article which says that Hamas shouldn't struggle. They shouldn't fight. So I need to dig that one up as well, because if that's the case, we are really in difficulties, right? Now, the point about this meeting in general is that comrades are in agreement on a lot of points, all right? But the problem is that you seem to be hung up on a whole series of generalizations which actually you accuse us of having. We have a broad perspective of imperialism, and it informs what we do. That is to say, our chief enemy is the British state. The idea that Britain is a decadent power is in many respects true, but actually it's much more powerful and much richer than it was in the Victorian period. It has atomic weapons, it's a leading member of NATO, and it doesn't take, any cheek from most other powers, as a matter of fact. It's cunning, slimy, deeply ingrained within the world's ruling classes through its educational system. It has what it pompously calls soft power, actually, and it does a lot of damage to working class people all around the world, all of the time. And to talk about it being some kind of subspecies of American imperialism is a serious mistake, I can assure you, right? So, let's get this clear. We have a number of key points which we're very concerned about your organisation. The whole obsession with trade unionism. I'm a trade union member, I've been a trade union member, I've seen trade union members go and actually disappear, right? TGWU, I've seen the labour aristocracy and electrical trades unions take their roles and their positions in support of the most reactionary positions of Labour Party, Labour government ever had in relationship to Ireland, right? We know that this world exists. We do not ignore it. We have members who've worked on delivering hamburgers and God knows what to people on bicycles in the new unions, right? We're there, right? So please don't think that we're not. The point is a question of emphasis. What you do with the other 80% of the working class? Who are the most militant sections of the working class? Who've shown they're prepared to fight? Actually, go out on the streets and fight. We think your orientation needs a dramatic change. And please stop patronising revolutionary movements around the rest of the world with your godforsaken advice, because they know a damn sight better what they're doing than you do here in Britain, subject to the bourgeois press.
I will take one more speaker. I'll take myself as a speaker for the SL and one more speaker from the RCG, if someone would like to indicate. Comrade there.
No, it's not.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's an independent. Is there another RCG
we'll
speaker?
select someone.
You'll select someone, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. So, I just want to take up this question of Ireland that has come up. And fundamentally, the question here is, how do communists relate to the nationalist movement? I'm going to speak specifically about Ireland, but this is a question in general. It's very much related to the theme of what we've been talking about. Now, once again, I will have to say the RCG has a very good record. Campaigning for British troops out of Northern Ireland while they were there, supporting Republican prisoners, calling out Labour when Labour MPs were going in to denounce Bobby Sands as he died on hunger strike in prison. There is no question about that. But although I'm past the sell-by date that Comrade Robert has mentioned, I'm old enough to remember coming here to London from Ireland and being told by the British left that we can't tell the Irish what to do, so I had to stick with nationalism. I'll just say on a personal note, I was not too pleased to hear that. I came here wanting to be a Marxist and a revolutionary like everybody else. Okay, so what is it about the nationalist movement? Here's the basic reason the nationalist movement in Ireland cannot liberate Ireland and not liberate the 6 counties from Britain is because of the nature of a nationalist movement. On the one hand, it represents in Ireland a very weak bourgeoisie, which, as we know, has been oppressed, retarded, and held back by imperialism for 800 years, or by England for 800 years, rather. And so at the time of independence, it was not able to liberate the country because of its class nature. Nationalism takes the just aspirations of the masses for their independence, but it ties them to the class interest of that bourgeoisie, which has its own reasons to be independent from Britain. And at the time of independence, the nationalist movement was absolutely incapable of doing the one thing that was needed. The one thing that was needed was to mobilize the whole Irish nation against British imperialism, and that includes the working class. Workers in Britain, in England and Wales and in Ireland were up in arms, stopping arms shipments to Ireland. There was a Hands Off Ireland campaign here in the British workers' movement. There was huge revolutionary upsurge of the working class, including in the countryside in Ireland. The nationalist movement was incapable of mobilizing those working class because it represented also, its leadership included the very bourgeoisie that smashed the trade union, the Transport and General Workers Union in the Dublin 1913 lockout. And it's because of the weakness and bankruptcy of the Irish nationalist movement that you not only failed, that you got partition. So now, okay, that's ancient history, you might say. But then there's 30 years of armed struggle by the same nationalist movement during the Troubles. What does it end up with? It ends up with a peace deal that is an exact replica of when Michael Collins signed that treaty and agreed to the partition. Gerry Adams sits down with the British and agrees to, they keep Northern Ireland, Britain keeps Northern Ireland, with this illusion that somehow, out of their own good graces, the Westminster government will grant a united Ireland. Well, let me tell you, it is not so. Hell will freeze over before Keir Starmer or any of his successors in the Labour Party as Prime Minister will let Ireland vote for Britain to get the hell out of the North. This is not going to happen. It's liberal nonsense, and it shows once again, from the partition of Ireland to the Good Friday Agreement, that nationalism has proven incapable of liberating Ireland. And the reason for this, here's where how communists relate to the nationalist movement. Look to James Connolly. The cause of Labour is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of Labour. So you need that national struggle cannot be left to the nationalists. It is for communists to take over the leadership of that struggle, expose illusions in Sinn Féin, and lead a struggle for an united Irish Workers' Republic. That is the only way forward.
I'll be very brief. What I just heard was quite appalling, quite outrageous. Right? The responsibility for the defeat of the Irish liberation struggle lies here, absolutely in Britain. Right? It lies with the trade union movement, it lies with the Labour Party, it lies with all forms of social democracy, it lies with the left who ran away, as I said earlier. That is where responsibility lies. Yeah? And to defer or distract in relation to inadequacy or otherwise of the national liberation struggle is an absolute negligence of our responsibilities. We're in Britain here. That's where the responsibilities lie for the defeat, right? And the point that I did make, right, is that it's the activity in the imperialist nation in support of the liberation struggle that strengthens the radical wing of that struggle, right? And therefore, the failure of the left in this country, the failure of the left strengthened the reactionary wings, which in the end did a deal with the British imperialist state. But have no doubt, if you're here in Britain, right, the responsibility for that defeat lies squarely with the movement in this country. Absolutely.
and to say that lies elsewhere in the inadequacies of the Irish struggle is in fact to undermine our responsibility.
I think we're probably ready to draw to a close. Is that your opinion, comrades? Yeah. So, if there's no one else, you said no to that independent. We will go to summaries from the speakers, and the summaries will go in reverse order. So, Comrade Cass will go first. For how long do you want? Followed by Comrade Vincent. Yeah, that's.
In the first response after the speakers spoke, someone said that I referred to your position on the trade unions as idealist and immaterial. I would now like to go further and say that your whole understanding of imperialism is idealist and immaterial. You see the world as you want to understand it and not as it is, while deflecting and saying that that is how everyone else approaches it. You have attributed to us throughout this debate a tendency to assign things as good or bad, but that actually seems to be the only way you are able to analyse the world. Not from a Marxist materialist position, beginning with a concrete understanding of imperialism, but superficially focusing on liberal politics and the middle-class treacherous leaders. In this first contribution, you argued against our materialist analysis of the trade unions as they actually exist in Britain, with your personal experience, your response to our materialist analysis of the fact that trade unions only represent a labour aristocracy and not the most oppressed sections of the working class was that your wages are going down. You have repeated multiple times that you do think there is a labour aristocracy, but you only write of the workers as an abstract mass. And what does Lenin say about this? On this trend, he says, "We do not want, they say, to break away from the masses and mass organizations. But just think how Engels put the question. In the 19th century, the mass organizations of the English trade unions were on the side of the bourgeois Labour Party, as they are now. Marx and Engels did not reconcile themselves to it on this ground. They exposed it. They did not forget, firstly, that the trade union organizations directly embraced a minority of the proletariat. In England then, as in Germany now, and again in England now, slightly different percentages, not more than 1/5 of the proletariat was organized. No one can seriously think it is possible to organize the majority of the proletariat under capitalism. And yet some people seem to think you can. You talk of the working class again moving towards the right. Who? Who is this working class moving towards the right? If you are so concrete, which sections of the working class is it? Because it is certainly not the bulk of the immigrant working class or the bulk of the black working class. So who is it that you are saying we must go to and organize with? You replied to Kotsai to say you do in fact understand state racism. Where? Where can we find this understanding? Where can we find this analysis? Because it is not in your articles. How do you suppose a fight against the racist British state will take place, as Kotsai asked? Will it be one day in the future after the righteous communist struggle against the union bosses? Is it after that which we will take on this secondary enemy that is the British state? My comrades have responded to many of your other points, and I don't want to repeat what they said, but I will reiterate what our position is on the question of how to fight imperialism. As Paul made clear, Britain is still a great imperialist power, not morally great, to be clear. And we as communists in Britain must wage our struggle against the imperialist British state. Any victorious fight against imperialism will require a revolutionary party, a communist party, fighting to seize state power. The movement from which this vanguard party will emerge will begin from a spontaneous struggle from the most oppressed and unorganized and unconfined sections of the working class. This is where we must organize as communists to fight imperialism. As I said, my comrades have answered these questions. I'm not going to repeat them, so I'm going to stop there.
Right. Well, thank you, comrades. I've opened by saying that for me, the fundamental problem with the RCG is that its work is hampered by ultra-leftism and moralism. There's been a number of examples, I think, in the interventions, but maybe it's not quite clear to everyone, and I hope we can have continued discussions to clarify those differences. I'll just respond to a few points in order. The trade unions, it's not just a question of emphasis, comrades. The issue with the RCG is that it argues that the trade unions are bastion of reaction. Now, I don't know why you comrades here who praised my quality as editor, I don't know why you are in a bastion of reaction. Like, how do you make sense of this? You say the unions are bastion of reactions, yet you have members in it, but you don't really do work in them. You see, like, that doesn't make any sense. The trade unions do represent a minority of the working class. The comrades have underlined it very well. Yes, they do. And it is absolutely key to go to the unorganized workers, and we seek to do this as well as much as we can. But the trade unions play an oversized, disproportionate role in every single struggles in this country. Unorganized workers, when they want to create a unions, they turn themselves to the existing unions. And they're not wrong in doing so. You know, it's actually easier to go through, well, it depends on the leaders, but it's usually easier to go through an existing union. They control a lot of the mass movements. As you know, Palestine, Stand Up to Racism, etc. They play a key central role in the dynamics of struggle in this country. So it's not just a matter of percentage. And I know you know this as well, because you fight all the time those trade union leaders in those demonstrations, you know. So it's not just like a matter of emphasis. Sometimes the discussion can be like this, and we can talk about priorities, but the communists in this country are duty-bound to actually put a lot of work into trade union works, into rebuilding the trade unions, because really these are the only organization workers have, and the only organization they can have to defend themselves on the workplace. And I find this notion of labor aristocracy that's been used as this sort of great mystique theory. I'm sorry, it's quite clear. Labor aristocrats are people who are bought off by imperialism and defend imperialism. They have six-figure salaries. They lead trade unions. It might be some workers who are like totally bourgeoisified, but the majority of workers, including in the trade unions, still live in the fundamental contradiction of this society between capital and labor. They are exploited. Yes, they might have a pension. Yes, they might be a bit better off. But I would note that the majority, a lot of the working class, including in the public sector, isn't. So that's what I said earlier. We need to leave the realms of abstraction and get into reality in terms of labor aristocracy. Abroad, so there's been a lot of intervention on what's the difference here. Our difference is our role only to cheer and support the most left-wing faction of whatever is out there, or is it to actually seek to build revolutionary parties abroad and a revolutionary international? We have comrades in different countries, in Mexico, in South Africa. They don't have the luxury to just support whatever's out there. They think and they join the organization because they believe we need something different. This conception of like, we don't criticize just works if you're trying to build communist party in Britain only. Like that's not the case. Comrades are right that our main task is to fight the British imperialists. They are absolutely right. And I can also understand why the RCG is a bit sick and tired of the left, you know, doing grand lesson about this or that revolution. It happens too often on the left. But let me make just one point. We're famous on the left for having defended the Soviet Union. Hard. We defended it against counter-revolution, and we're very proud of that record, including in Berlin, in Germany, in East Germany, and in Moscow. Imperialism destroyed the Soviet Union, but an entire wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union gave up on the Soviet Union, sold out the DDR, sold out East Europe, sold out the land of the October Revolution. So how can you stand there and be so confident in the policy of the Cuban Communist Party? A Cuban Communist Party who has welcomed Obama, whose actually strategic perspective is to get another Obama in office in the United States and get a good deal with US imperialism. And a Communist Party who is increasingly pursuing policies which are hated by the working class, who has put everything into tourism at the expense of developing the infrastructures of the country. That's true. That's the course they have set for the Cuban Revolution. And there's an extreme problem of corruption. I think all of this is being concealed by the comrades under the pretext that we cannot make criticism. Our task is to fight in Britain. Our task is to fight in Britain. But our task is to fight on the planet as well, and to help Cubans who do want to defend the revolution, but who hate those privileged layers, just as there was plenty in the Soviet Union, to find a path. And the path the RCG offers them is all hail the Cuban Communist Party. Well, I'm sorry, comrades, we cannot go there. Imperialism, geopolitics. I think there's a moralism here. Moralism, the comrade asked me like, oh, it's like this moral thing. If we say that Britain is not like, is kind of a subordinate imperialist power, it means we're soft on the British ruling class. No, we're not. It's just understanding the world. Since the Second World War, the United States is the hegemonic power on the planet. They have hundreds of bases across the globe. Actually, a lot of them came from Britain, sold the bases to pay their debt to the US. The British imperialists are often deluded about this. They try to wage a war in Suez. The US says, no, you're not. And they had to retreat. The point isn't that the British imperialists are less of a predatory force than they used to be. It's just the reality of the world. The world is a US empire, and Britain plays like a key pillar role in this. It still means that the main enemy of our class are the British imperialists at home, but it does mean as well that the broader struggle against US hegemony matter. For me, that's just part of basic understanding of the relations of imperialism today and how the world works. And I'll just briefly conclude as well, in terms of the trade union, an independent ask our record, we don't have like, it's quite modest. We've been fighting in the trade union for like 2 years. We can speak to the comrades who are fighting and doing this work. We've ran on campaign to exclude the bosses from the unions. We've ran campaign I laughed at your intervention about the Palestine saying, where I think because we fought against those things, try to at least do even a small action, a small something walkout or a small support to this or that action to break down that conception that wearing green is a trade union action. It isn't. We've also intervened against Comrade Aldi. I don't know if you supported him, but you're waging a whole campaign also to stop funding labor inside your TUC union. And so this is the kind of work we're doing. But just to conclude on the Revolutionary Party, in my presentation, I tried to lay out like what's our perspective and what's our strategy. We see fight in the trade union as key, fight in the working class in general is key. The left is way too much turned to campus, to petty bourgeois layers. We need to go into the workers, organized and unorganized. And I tried to put forward a perspective of, we think the left must fight for a break with liberal politics inside the organization of the left, inside your party, whatever you want to call it, inside whatever organizations they are. And we think that the emergence of a revolutionary trend in Britain, that's what we fight for, will emerge of those who follow this course, working class and those socialists who are really breaking with liberalism. And that's how we see the building of a revolutionary trend. I'm still at pain to understand what is the RCG's plan. Like the socialist left, your organization, our organization, all the other organizations, however we hate each other, we're in a big crisis. We're small. The model, the status quo, which has dominated the far left for the last decades, does not work anymore. Just organization competing each other. There's a general crisis of the Marxist movement in the West. It has to be overcome. We think it's linked to the dominance of liberal politics and the petty bourgeois character of our organization. What is the answer of the RCG? And I have yet to hear more than just, we need to build a vanguard party, and presumably we'll build it by joining the RCG. Well, that's not a path to get out of the deep crisis the Marxist movement finds itself in. And I'll end on this. Thank you.
Okay.